Hello, today we're going to talk about properties of solids. There are 4 types of solids we're going to talk about, and they go right along with the bonds that we've been talking about. So we have ionic solids, metallic solids, molecular solids, and then network covalent solids. And the predominant bond that we're going to talk about for each of them, ionic compounds have ionic bonds, metallic substances have metallic bonds, molecular have covalent bonds and intermolecular forces, and network covalent just has covalent bonds. So ionic compounds will have a lattice structure, positive and negative ions in an alternating lattice, depending on the formula of the particular ionic compound. The energy required to break apart the lattice is called the lattice energy, and it depends on Coulombic attractions. And so when it melts or boils, the ionic bonds are going to break. This leads to ionic solids tend to have very high melting points because they have to break the actual ionic bonds in order to get it to melt. They also have high boiling points because of that. They tend to be brittle, they tend to conduct electricity, but only when melted or dissolved in water. They tend to have lower vapor pressures, so they don't evaporate easily. Covalent network solids are a little bit different. Covalent network solids is where you have covalent bonds, so they're sharing electrons, but it forms this giant lattice structure. So you'll have covalent bonds, and they just continue in like a major structure in however many directions, and it just makes this. It's still a lattice like ionic compounds, but it doesn't have ionic bonds. It has covalent bonds. And there's a few that you should know that form covalent network solids. So diamond is an example. Graphite is an example. Silicon dioxide is a good example. So diamond, graphite, and this is the main component of glass. But these are just all connected by covalent bonds. That means they're going to all be nonmetals. Usually will indicate that like an ionic compounds will have metals and nonmetals. Covalent network solids will just have nonmetals, but they have to give you some kind of indication that those nonmetals are forming a covalent network solid instead of just a molecular solid, which we'll talk about next. So these 3 you definitely need to know. Our covalent network, if it's a different example, they'll have to give you something. Like they'll give you a drawing like this, or they'll give you that the melting point or boiling point is very high. High melting points, high boiling points. Because in order for a covalent network solid to melt or boil, it has to break covalent bonds, so it requires lots and lots of energy. So yeah, most of the time if you just see nonmetals, it's going to be molecular. Once in a while, it will be one of these network covalent. Okay, so molecular solids are covalently bound compounds, but that are only interconnected by intermolecular forces. So they're still only nonmetals, but they don't have continuous covalent bonds. Some of them are connected with covalent bonds to form those individual molecules, and then the molecules are connected to each other using intermolecular forces. So let me draw water as an example. Water is a molecule, a molecular compound, and each water molecule is its own distinct unit with covalent bonds. They are held together by intermolecular forces. In this case, hydrogen bonding is probably the strongest intermolecular force, but it also has dipole-dipole and London dispersion forces. So in a molecular solid, we're talking about ice here for water, you're going to see a whole bunch of these intermolecular forces present, but because they're intermolecular, they're a lot easier to break than, say, the covalent bonds or the ionic bonds in the solids we've already talked about. So molecular solids tend to have lower melting points and lower boiling points than the other types of solids because they're only breaking intermolecular forces. Some other examples would also include like carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide is a molecule. It can form London dispersion forces with other carbon dioxide molecules. And those London dispersion forces are relatively weak, which means that carbon dioxide has a very low melting point, low boiling point, although technically carbon dioxide likes to just undergo sublimation instead and go straight from a solid to a gas. But solid carbon dioxide is called dry ice, but it's another example of a solid molecular substance. So the last type of solid is a metallic solid, which has to have the metal cations and then a sea of mobile valence electrons. They're free to move around, or we say delocalized electrons. That causes it to be more malleable, more ductile, and to conduct electricity as a solid. But they still have pretty high melting points and boiling points depending on the metal. Now, don't forget that we also have alloys of metals. So substitutional alloys, you have very similar sized metals forming the alloy, so it just takes the place of another metal in the compound or in the substance. Then interstitial alloys, you have one substance that is much smaller than the other. So in an interstitial alloy, the other substance that is much smaller will fit in between. Now don't forget that we also have very, very large molecules and polymers that exist as solids. You can have very large like lipids that are saturated, and so then you'd have solid fats or lards like butter or Crisco. Those are solids, but they're these giant molecules that are just conglomerations of individual monomers. So we call them polymers, and you don't need to know very much about them, but there's biomolecules, which include like DNA, proteins, sugars, and lipids. Those are all different types of polymers because they consist of individual monomers. DNA is made up of nucleic acids, nucleotides. Protein is made up of amino acids. Sugars is made up of monosaccharides, so things like glucose, and lipids are made up of fatty acids. And they hook together to form these big polymers. Another class then of polymers would be plastics. So things that typically will start with the word poly, like polyvinyl chloride or PVC. It's a type of plastic. Polyethylene. There's a whole bunch of them, but essentially you're just going to connect a whole bunch of these individual units to create this large structure. And they are so different that it's hard to classify particular characteristics of them. Unlike ionic and network covalent, you have some that have very low melting points. You have some that have really high melting points. You have some that are very rigid, some that are very malleable. But there's just this huge field of different plastics that are polymers, but they're a type of solid. You just don't need to know a whole lot about it for this class. Okay, so for an example, let's look at CO2 versus SiO2. They both have nonmetals, only nonmetals in the compound, but CO2 has a melting point of -78 degrees Celsius, whereas SiO2 has a melting point of 1650 degrees Celsius. And to explain that, so CO2, the easiest way ever to explain melting points, boiling points, is to look at their intermolecular forces. CO2 is just nonmetals, right? And it is perfectly symmetrical, so it's nonpolar. It only has London dispersion forces, which are relatively weak. SiO2, on the other hand, it also has just nonmetals, but because of this super high melting point, it's probably a covalent network solid. which SiO2 is one of those ones that you need to remember anyway, so you should know that. It's glass, has a very high melting point. So if we were to talk about what's actually happening here, in order for CO2 to melt at that really cold temperature, the only thing that needs to break are those London dispersion forces. In order for silicon dioxide to melt, or glass to melt, you have to break covalent bonds, which are much, much stronger and requires more energy.